Rents are falling in some of Canada's most expensive cities. That's something that you're either probably very surprised to hear if you're hearing it for the first time, or something that you're beginning to notice, but you never thought you would hear in your lifetime. Now, instead of going into all the reasons myself, Andrew Chang on CBC About That did a really good breakdown on this. So I'm actually going to just play this. I'll probably comment on some of it, but I do want to hear your thoughts, both as a tenant paying rent in Ontario and in Canada, and as a landlord who is collecting rents and has started to see a shift in that market, both in major cities. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about secondary markets. And I invest myself and have some properties in Sudbury and North Bay. And so I think there's less impact having there, but I am curious to hear your thoughts on the ground. Let's get into it.
So here's something I didn't think I'd see anytime soon. Check out this 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment in downtown Toronto. The last time it was up for rent, it was going for $2,380 a month. That was in 2022. It was put back up for rent this month for $2,288 a month. Almost $100 cheaper. Here's another listing from Vancouver. 1 bed, 1 bath. In June 2023, it was renting for $25.90. Now it's $24.90. Again, $100 difference.
Rent prices are finally starting to fall after a steep and punishing climb.
Yeah, rent has been on its way down for a few months now. And here's what it looked like in Canada's major cities at the end of last year, according to data by rentals.ca, in the Vancouver area, Calgary, and in the Toronto area, which is confusing, right? Because we're in an affordability crisis in this country, especially in these cities. The cost of housing has never been higher, and yet rent, while still high, is getting cheaper.
So first off, rents are higher than they've ever been previously before. So the fact that they're coming down a little bit is good news. And I think probably it wasn't sustainable because, I mean, people who can't afford to get a home need to be able to rent. And so if you can't afford your rent, you know, this is why we're seeing tent cities and this mass unaffordability that we're seeing. So, you know, I'm curious to see how much they might come down and if they'll continue to. I don't think they can continue to drop forever. But, you know, they talk more about supply and demand here that will explain a little bit more and maybe give us more insight into it.
We haven't seen rents fall at the national level like this in at least 20 years. It's a story of demand and supply.
We'll get to the demand. Let's start with the supply. In 2024, housing supply in big cities actually went up a fair bit. And if you're thinking, what are you talking about? I thought we were in a supply crisis.
Supply is extremely concentrated. We're not seeing any new listings.
We have to build a lot. We have to increase supply significantly.
Now, suddenly you're saying, wait a second, there's so much supply in this particular category that the prices are going to plummet?
I'd qualify all this by saying big cities finished building a lot of one kind of supply. High-rise buildings with tons of units, both condo and purpose-built rental apartment buildings. In Toronto last year, more than 5,000 apartment units finally came online.
The same dynamics are in Vancouver as well, that we had a lot of construction of purpose-built rental that had begun in 2017, 2018, that's now hitting the market.
And so this has been the narrative, something I've talked about myself and something we've been fed. And I think truth to it, that there was not enough supply in terms of housing and purpose-built rentals, which have become more expensive to build. But because these were being built previously in years past, they're now coming to market, which is, I think, a lot of them coming at the same time. So having kind of a big impact that we should have seen coming, but maybe didn't really expect.
That's a lot of rentals suddenly available.
These buildings are, when they come on stream at like 300, 350, 250 units at a time. And these are owned by companies. So there is incredible pressure to fill the building up immediately.
It creates competition that you've got these new units online, and you've got the building owner who wants to rent them out.
Which all makes sense. More units brings prices down. But where are all these buildings coming from? Well, these are projects that were started years ago when interest rates and building costs were low and when government policy encouraged these types of builds.
And even before the pandemic, we'd seen prices and rents rise in a lot of communities going back to about 2016 or so. And that created the conditions to get new buildings started. So part of that was economic conditions, and part of it was policies like the federal government making more mortgage loans available for apartment construction.
And while 2016 feels like a lifetime ago, Trump won his first election, Brexit became real, Brad and Angelina broke up. These buildings can take about 6, 7, 8 years on average from start to finish. And back then, there was a lot of demand for these types of high-rise rental builds.
We have seen in 2023 and 2024 a lot of buildings come online that were planned, almost a decade ago.
But there's another side of the supply part of this equation, and that's condos.
I'll just say this: it's such a weird scene when all this pre-construction investing was happening, and it was working for many years, and now we're seeing a building get finished. So 300 units all of a sudden become available. Most of these people aren't moving into them; they're going to rent it, and so you have all of a sudden 300 units available, and they all want $2,500. But when there's that many available, the renter or the tenant can have more control and dictate the price more, because they have, somebody's going to be willing to go down to 24. Maybe somebody's willing to go down to 23. So yeah, when that happens, it's such a kind of a weird scene. There's just so many to choose from. And then investors are all of a sudden, quote unquote, investors are all of a sudden like, oh, wow, I thought I was going to just be able to rent this out and start making money right away, which isn't always the case.
Because a ton more of those were also completed last year. 30,000 units in Toronto alone.
It was a record high. The average over the last 10 years is about 20,000 units, so it's like 10,000 units higher than what's considered to be average.
That's a lot of condos being added to the market, but what happens when you can't sell them? Well, you might rent them. You see, a lot of condos aren't bought by people actually planning to live in them. They're often investment properties. 65% of condos under 600 square feet are bought just to make money. Because for a while there, pre-sale condos were kind of a great way to turn a big profit. You'd buy a condo before construction at a decent price, and the market was appreciating so quickly that by the time that condo was finished, maybe you could sell it for double what you bought it for. Easy money.
Those were the days.
But in the
right?
last couple of years, the math on all of that has changed. Construction costs are higher. Development fees are higher. Interest rates are higher. It all went up, meaning that healthy profit that you could take right to the bank got gobbled up. And what seemed like a great investment might actually have ended up costing you money.
You had a lot of, kind of mom and pop investors who bought pre-construction condos 7 or 8 years ago, now have taken possession of them, and they don't entirely know what to do with them.
New condo sales in the Toronto area dropped to the lowest quarterly total since the financial crisis.
Toronto's particularly bad for this. Listings are at record highs. Sales are at a 30-year low. And if you can't sell, what then?
There's nobody living in a townhouse or a house that wants to move into a 455 square foot Dog Creek condo, right? They never planned on living there. No one at all.
A lot of times they're saying, well, I'm going to rent this thing out, right? Because my other options aren't looking fantastic.
Bingo. Those condo units end up flooding the rental market. And now, in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, growth in unit completions is actually outpacing population growth.
That means you have more supply that could potentially be available per
Which is hard to believe.
So that's been trending upwards pretty dramatically.
And here's the thing. This massive expansion of supply is only half the explanation. Canada's population grew by about 3 million people in the last 3 years. And that's a pretty central development in this whole housing crunch.
The Canadian rental market reached a record high last month.
Another record high last month.
A record high in January.
So in the GTA, the population was growing by about, 9 people for every studio apartment, right? And you can't really fit 9 people in a studio apartment, right? So that creates these tensions.
You can see, if we look at Ontario, just how much condo rent climbed in tandem basically with the rise in population. The dip was the pandemic. But these unsustainable prices were a big part of the reason the government pulled a U-turn on its immigration policy.
Today, we're announcing that we will reduce the number of immigrants we bring in over the next 3 years, which will result in a pause in the population growth.
That backpedal on Canada's immigration policy is a big factor contributing to weakening rental demand, given newcomers do represent a large share of the renter base. The average newcomer has historically rented for the first 5 to 10 years living in Canada.
Well, I mean, most of them have to because we also have a foreign buyer ban in place. So they're not able to just come here and immediately buy a place.
This incredible boom in population for 3 years is now going to turn into a substantial bust.
And if you want to see the effects of these policy changes playing out in real time, just look at the cap on international students that was announced at the beginning of last year.
The federal government will cap the number of student permits over the next 2 years.
According to Universities Canada, there were 45% fewer international students enrolled in colleges and universities in the fall of 2024 compared to the year before.
Which is like, we needed to slow that up for sure, but it seems like we, like people tend to do in these situations, and governments specifically, swing way too far on the other side. Like, why be so extreme? Why don't we taper off a little bit? It seems a little extreme.
Places like London, Ontario, and Kitchener that have high student populations are also seeing rents fall fast.
It's not a coincidence that the communities where we're seeing rents drop the fastest are communities that have high international student populations.
And there is another factor here that's playing a role in the decrease in demand in big cities.
The cost of living in Canada is sick.
Does someone want to explain to me why Canada is so expensive, but it just doesn't even make sense?
It doesn't even make sense. Yeah, that's the natural reaction to the cost of living crisis that we've been experiencing.
Consider this. Nationally, the unemployment rate was 6.7% in December, up from 5% just 2 years earlier. But in Toronto and the surrounding areas, it was a lot higher, 8.4% in December. And for younger people, it was even higher than that, 14.4% across the country. And the younger you are, the more likely you are to be a renter.
And so with that in mind, it's very possible that the labor market weakening could be putting downward pressure on rental demand as few younger people move out onto their own into most likely what would be a rental.
Well, because they can't, right? Like I said, it's not sustainable. And if a young person can't move out, they're just not going to. They're going to stay at home.
So yes, maybe more people are staying home with their parents or splitting the bills with roommates. In British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, listings for shared accommodations have shot up nearly 50% in the last year.
I can't afford a one-bedroom by myself, I don't think. So if you need a roommate...
I'm trying to find a new roommate.
Now, cheaper rent doesn't mean cheap rent. Those units I showed you at the beginning are still well over $2,000 for one bedroom. But a lot of these trends we've been seeing do look like they will continue this year. More building completions and population decline to come. So if you are a renter, this year might not be a bad time to look around.
So what are your thoughts? Are you noticing a change in rents as a tenant and as a landlord? And are you hopeful that maybe you haven't been able to move out, or maybe you've been stuck in a situation, whether at home or with roommates, or, maybe in not so comfortable a situation that you have no choice but to stay in for now? But it sounds like there is hope around the corner in terms of rents being a little bit more reasonable. But I guess it really depends on which perspective you're looking at it from. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, if I can ever do anything to help in your journey, feel free to reach out, book a call below using the Calendly link, or simply shoot me a text, and I'm happy to chat. Till then, I'll see you on the next one.